Most of the media got what they wanted in the hush money trial. They can always call Donald Trump a convicted felon. The jury, after just 2 days, finding the former president guilty on all 34 counts. But that doesn't mean the election's over. Far from it. This might even help Trump, who's been attacking the judicial system as rigged, and much of his loyal base agrees. That's right. Joe Biden may have trouble beating Donald Trump despite his new legal baggage, with many Democrats privately panicking about Biden's chances as he slightly trails his predecessors. So we have a deeply divided country, with one part outraged by the Trump conviction, the other part celebrating the Stormy Daniels case, and the media completely and utterly polarized. In fact, the commentators couldn't agree on much of anything, including Judge Juan Merchan.
This is, by every measure, a travesty of justice perpetrated by Judge Juan Merchan.
With respect to Judge Merchan, I mean, I am like now, you know, I have like a man crush on him.
One thing's for certain, it all came down to the jury. I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. Donald Trump unloaded on various targets on Friday, taking no questions.
We have a president and a group of fascists that don't want to do anything about it because they could right now, today, he could stop it. But he's not. They're destroying our country. They were literally crucified by this man who looks like an angel, but he's really a devil. So we're going to be appealing this scam.
The guilty verdict produced passionate takes by the pundits on all sides.
I'm not that surprised. This thing always felt preordained. It feels more arranged than a marriage in Kabul.
It is now in the hands of the American people to decide if we will accept those efforts or whether we will stand by the rule of law and recognize this as a fair proceeding.
This is a humiliating day for the country that we all love. It makes us look like a joke to the rest of the world. Is this what they meant by the American way?
Trump and his lawyers thought they could bully their way through these proceedings.
And some were outright celebrating.
The pearl clutching amongst Republicans about the idea that he would go to jail from the people who were cheering Donald Trump's lock her up chant in 2016 is a little rich, I will say. It's a little rich.
All right, I think we need some Bloody Marys all around at this point.
Joining us now to analyze the coverage in Nashville, Tomi Lahren, the host of Tomi Lahren is Fearless on OutKick, and from Orlando, Leslie Marshall, the radio talk show host. Both are Fox News contributors. Tomi, I'm sure you think this case should never have been brought. I certainly thought it was flimsy and openly political, but didn't it come down to both sides trying to convince these 12 jurors?
Yeah, well, again, I don't blame the jury. I blame the judge for the instructions. And we could go all day long into the legalities. I've been following this minute by minute, as I'm sure both of you have as well. But to me, the more sickening part here is the way that the media has been covering it, the way that the media has been celebrating this. It was a dark day for justice. It was a dark day for America, no matter if you like Donald Trump or you don't like Donald Trump. And these are some of the same media pundits, hacks, as I would call them, that don't want anybody else to go to jail. They don't want anybody else to have the book thrown at them, and then they write a new book and they throw it at Donald Trump, and then they celebrate that. But I think far more than this guilty conviction and them wanting to call him a convicted felon, I think far more than that, they would rather talk about Donald Trump, as they always have, than talk about failing Joe Biden and failing Kamala Harris and failing America under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So this did them a favor in more ways than one, and it's really a travesty to watch them celebrate like they are.
Leslie, the judge said you cannot convict on Michael Cohen's testimony. You have to find corroborating evidence. And I think the flaw in the defense has always been they had no alternative when it came to the emails and the texts and the signal messages and the banking records, which tended to back up what Michael Cohen was saying.
Well, look, you know, when people talk about blame, one of the things that's great about our nation is our system. And, you know, whether you like the outcome of the verdict or not, many people were angry many years ago in the outcome, as I was in the O.J. Simpson trial. But the jurors base their decisions on what is presented by the prosecution and the defense. I honestly, Howie, thought going into this, I didn't think there'd be 34 counts of guilty. I was surprised about that. And even though I watched a lot of the trial, I wasn't sitting in the juror's box. I wasn't in the courtroom. So the jury deliberated not just based on the judge's instructions, but specifically based on the evidence or lack of evidence that was presented by both sides. So your point to me is exactly why the jury came down with those 34 guilty counts.
Right. You know, Tommy, the media are deeply divided, as you pointed out. They are, you have Trump saying that it's Biden who's a threat to democracy because he has tainted the criminal justice system, and you have Biden saying Trump is destroying confidence in the judicial system. So they're both making, taking different sides of the same coin in terms of this argument.
Yeah, and again, I don't want the American people to lose confidence in the judicial system or in the justice system. That's not what I want. I don't want that for my country. But to me, it is really rich, as I mentioned before, Howie, when you've got these individuals that don't want anyone to go to jail. They want everyone to get out of jail free card. They want cashless bail. They want thugs and felons to roam the streets. They want illegal immigrants who beat up cops to get plea deals. But then they celebrate Donald Trump saying no one is above the law. No one is above the law. But Donald Trump has been existing below the law. And the fact that they're celebrating it when they want everybody else to wreak havoc and do as they please, that to me is really rich.
Wait, they want illegal immigrants to beat up cops? Or is that the result of the border?
Well, they have illegal immigrants that are beating up cops that are getting plea deals. Let's be honest, Howie. We saw that in New York City. They don't take these people who even have jumped cops and attacked cops on camera. They think those people should be given the benefit of the doubt. But Donald Trump, the book should be thrown at him, even if it's a book nobody's ever read before or ever seen before.
Yeah, you know, I'm kind of with both of you on this point, which is it's a sad day for our country. You love Trump, you despise Trump, wherever you are, it's kind of, 34 counts. Leslie, you're saying that was a surprise. I thought there might be one holdout, and then you'd have a mistrial. So the constant media coverage, even though it's a terrible TV show because we're just looking at text from the reporters, and then later you get the transcript, seems to me that the media will not come off this story, maybe because the ratings are good.
Yeah, it's about the ratings. I mean, come on. Every media entity is a business at the end of the day, and you got to have your bottom line, and you want that bottom line to be higher. And Donald Trump is good for ratings. I mean, whether he's, sitting as a defendant, in a jury trial, or whether he's out, giving speeches, as we saw prior to both the 2016 and the 2020 election. Tommy and I rarely agree. I would agree with her on I don't want the American people to lose faith in our justice system. But it goes far beyond the former president, because there are certainly people on the right and the left that are screaming against our system, whether it's because a Supreme Court member's wife hangs a flag upside down and he won't recuse himself, whether it's because somebody thinks that politically rigged or railroaded a former president just was, is a convicted felon on 34 counts. The list goes on. And I'm sure for those on the right, especially with the upcoming trials, which are actually more serious in charges,
much more serious.
Which I would expect, much more serious in charges. I think we're going to hear, a lot of this rhetoric. And I think both sides get angry with hypocritical statements of the other. I take the whole show just to sit here and give hypocritical statements on both sides when it comes especially to the justice system.
Michael Cohen is now a hero on the left. Despite the fact that he admits repeatedly lying, despite the fact that he went to prison for lying, despite the fact that he lied to Congress and investigators and so forth. And he's been doing the rounds on MSNBC, incredibly long interview with Rachel Maddow and colleagues that went on and on and on. Let's take a look.
It's the media that wants to portray me as this sort of bombastic character. It's really not my nature.
He's not a bombastic character. That's a surprise to me. Although he certainly kept his cool in his testimony, but anybody who's gotten a phone call from Michael Cohen, he's unhappy, knows he's a bombastic character. All right, let me go to Tommy. How much does this affect the election or not, especially if Trump draws some jail time on July 11th, which, of course, is going to be 2 months of media speculation?
Right. Well, right now, I think that the haul that his campaign has been able to achieve in terms of fundraising over the last couple of days has been astounding. And yes, you've had some high-dollar donations coming in from the Adelson family, but you've also had a number of small donors, people that have never donated before, that saw this verdict, and they were rightfully so very angry. And they might even believe, hey, listen, if Donald Trump loses fair and square, he loses fair and square, but he's not going to lose because he's a political prisoner. So I think this is going to breathe new life and energy into his campaign, something that the other side simply doesn't have. I don't think anybody would look at Biden-Harris, even if you're a Biden-Harris supporter, and say that that campaign has energy or that that candidate has energy. So, again, this is going to do well for Donald Trump in terms of fundraising, but the Democrats got what they wanted because we're talking about this and we're not talking about Joe Biden's failing policies, which is what we should actually be talking about.
Leslie, I've got about a minute for you to weigh in on the election impact.
Look, the people that support Donald Trump are going to support him no matter what. The people that support Joe Biden are going to support him no matter what. And those aren't the people that are going to determine this election. And we've seen that for the last numerous decades, election cycles in the general election. It's going to come down to 6 states and a sliver of people, largely independents in those states. And Howie, I'm going to say you're on national television. By some of the polling I'm seeing right now, I might have been wrong when I said I don't think this is going to move the needle at all because this is not a kitchen table issue that voters on either side of the aisle or independents are concerned about. They're not concerned about the trial. Some of them are like, trial, oh yeah, heard something about that in the Northeast. But at the end of the day, what I'm seeing right now, I've seen 2 polls that have come out that are showing, and we've seen numbers like 60% of people that based on this verdict, that they don't feel that Donald Trump is fit to serve, if you will. And that may come down in November to just that 1 or 2% margin, and that is all either the president or former president needs to win or lose this.
Okay, guys, stick around. We want to hear from Andy McCarthy next on the coverage of the trial.
I'm Steve Doocy. I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.